Hello, hello. Welcome to another installment of Cage's Comments. I am Alex Cage, and today I will be commenting on the very exciting NBA free agency from the last couple of weeks. I took a little, I don't know, it's been about 2 weeks since I made one of these. Was hoping to make one of these a little closer to the reaction of some of the early moves, but may have sunburned myself a little too much on 4th of July to want to make a video right then after. So here we are a couple weeks later, but I think honestly that's probably good. I've had a little more time to sit and think about some of the things that have happened, and of course got to see the Spurs full kind of free agency for them. Wemby has signed his new deal, and we will start with the Spurs. But we'll start with the two smaller deals that they've made, both of which I like, both of which I am happy about. The first is Champagnie. I said before free agency that I thought he was going to get a $20 to $25 million a year deal, and that I was actually more worried about whether or not the Spurs could get like a declining structure. And boy, was I wrong. He got 3 years, 45 million, $15 million a year. That is excellent. It is a great bit of business for the Spurs. And as this team gets more expensive from its stars, having a guy like him that can easily slot in as your fourth or fifth starter and provide value with his 3-point shooting and rebounding, I think it's excellent. It's a great deal. Honest to God, my only issue with the deal is that I wish they had basically gotten the Tari Eason deal and gotten him to sign for 5 years at that rate, right? Tari Eason got, I think, 5 years, 80 million, so like 16 per year. I wish Spurs, that is about my only complaint, is that I wish the Spurs had been able to get him locked up for a couple more seasons. But that is a good bit of business, and I'm very happy about that. Tobias Harris, also a good signing, I think. 2 years, 31 million. So I talked about how I wanted the Spurs to get John Collins, or I thought Rui Hachimura was a legitimate player to go after. Excuse me. I did not think that Tobias Harris would be available unless the Pistons made like the trade for Tyler Hero and they got someone else that could kind of create their own shot without Cade. So I thought they would really want to hold on to Harris, even if, ideally you would want someone better as that second creator on your team. They just didn't have a better option. The Pistons did not. The Pistons went and got John Collins, who I think is good. He's fine. He can hit the corner three. He's athletic. He'll be a lob threat for Cade as well, but he's not really a shot creator. Tobias Harris, on the other hand, can do that a bit. My only concern really would be his age, right? If this is the year that he gets old and he just falls off a cliff, then obviously that's not great. But not going to have to be the second best shot creator on the team, right? Obviously, I mean, you've got Harper, Fox, Castle, Wemby that will all Vassell even, right? That will all do that. So it's, can you be versatile enough defensively and knock down open shots, hopefully a little bit higher percentage on those corner threes. And I think he can, while also offering you a little, against the Magic. He had a 3-4 game tear right there where he was just absolutely on fire. And then against the Cavs, not so much, right? Like but again, with the Spurs, smaller role. Very happy about that. Gives the Spurs kind of that versatility to play a little bit bigger next to Wemby. So I really like that. I think kind of early lineup predictions with the Spurs: Fox, Castle, Vassell, Champagny, and Wimby. I think you stick with that starting five that got you all the way to the finals. I know there's going to be calls to get Harper in there. I don't think they're one. You're not benching Fox. You're not benching $50 million a year. You're just not doing it. That would be unprecedented. I don't think the three guard lineup, unless Castle or Harper really went out this summer and gets a reliable 3-point shot, is going to be a viable lineup to do more than maybe just in the games with. And even then, I'm not so sure that that's the best idea. But I think Harper will finish games. I made a video about that. But Fox, Castle, Vassell, Champagny, Wimby as your starters. And now you've got Cornette, obviously, to back up Wimby. You've got Tobias Harris that can bump Carter Bryant from having to play the backup 4 to being able to play the backup 3. And then you've got Harper, obviously, as your backup guard with Johnson and Barnes, and then maybe, Terrace Reed and Quaintance filling out the other forward spots. They also just today, Spurs announced that they've re-signed McLaughlin, so there's your backup or third string point guard, your fourth guard. If Gillespie, the second round pick, is on two-way most of the year, as I imagine he will be. So good bit of business from the Spurs, and then also, of course, the Wimby max extension, not the Supermax, right? So taking the 25% versus the 30, very similar to Jalen Brunson, right? He's basically, $10 million-ish a year less on average for the Spurs to be a little more flexible. So I think a couple of things here. One, on a bit of a semantic issue, I have seen just kind of random people on Twitter and stuff, pay cuts, things like that. It's not a pay cut. He's going to get a massive raise. It is a discount that he's taking as opposed to what he could have taken, whether he just waited another year to sign a full 5-year, supermax contract, or signed an extension that was a max but had the escalators for the supermax. I don't. Wimby is obviously worth the supermax. I am not positive, or excuse me, I should say, I don't really think that star players need to take less in order to put championship teams around him. I know Brunson did. However, I have yet to actually see anyone point to the deal or trade that could not have been made if Brunson had taken all of the money he could have. The whole Knicks team, with the exception of Jose Alvarado, who they got at the deadline for Yabusele. I probably just butchered his name. But with the exception of that move, which they, if I'm not mistaken, still would have been able to make because Jose Alvarado makes almost no money. And the deal they signed Yabusele to was also for almost no money, but it was slightly more than what Alvarado makes, and you can take less money back in a 1-for-1 trade like that. There's nothing that they couldn't have done to keep the team because everyone was already on the roster. Now, if they wouldn't have made that trade because their owner wouldn't have paid the second Abram tax, that's not to me, that's not a Jalen Brunson thing. That's you have a cheap owner. And the fact that he wasn't willing to go into the tax to keep, Mitchell Robinson, if I were Jalen Brunson, I'd be like, what's the money for? So I say all that to say I don't love putting the onus on the players to take less money when, you know, they have obviously a much shorter time. That being said, if that is what players wish to do, they deserve credit for doing that. And obviously no one should be, yeah, he signed for $250 million instead of $1/3 billion. Oh, poor Wemby, right? Like I'm not crying poor for anyone in this situation. I guess I just don't like that. Seemingly, we're gonna cry poor for the billionaire owner, but Wemby did take less than what he could have. I put in my group chat with my friends when this went down. I really only care about that if it, I guess, successfully puts the onus on Castle to not take the max as well, which I'm not sure. We'll see. There will obviously be a ton of public pressure to do that because Wemby did it, and how are you going to make more money than Wemby, or not do it, not follow that example? But we'll see if Castle follows. But the only reason I care is because I don't think Castle is a guy, and I don't think he'll be eligible for the Supermax because I don't think he's going to be an All NBA guy. But I don't think he's a 20. I don't think he's shown that he should be 25% of the salary cap. Right, just a regular max guy. Harper, I do think has shown that. We'll see what he looks like for the next couple of seasons. But I am not convinced, based on the first 2 years of Castle, that that's actually the contract that would be, kind of fair to, fair market value, so to speak. But if Wemby had taken the Supermax, then I think he definitely would have been, at the very least, asking for that. And so we'll see if he, I don't think he's going to be eligible for the Supermax. So if Wemby took 5% less, every single year than what he was eligible for, then, is Castle willing to do the same and take a little bit less than the max? And if that's the case, then I think is actually, the bigger story, so to speak, as opposed to like Wemby's worth 30% of the cap. He just is, right? Like I don't think there's really a discussion there. He was third in MVP voting. He's the best defensive player in the league, and he's only 22. Castle, I don't think has shown like, oh, he's definitely going to be worth the max, the 25%. So if he's actually willing to take 20 or 18% or whatever the case may be, then I think that is actually a true win. If this, ripples down to a guy like Castle taking what I think would actually be closer to fair market value as opposed to maxing him out, then I think the Spurs have actually done more than just like, oh, save the billionaire a few $1 million on a check that he would have written to other billionaires. So happy, but overall happy with Spurs offseason. I think they are good for that Tobias Harris, as opposed to like the draft picks, is someone that can come in and make an impact now, and I think have an impact in a playoff series later this season. So very happy with Spurs. Next, I want to talk about, as I believe it was Bill Simmons. If it was not, someone correct me on the Snowtime Lakers, right? The the new look Los Angeles Lakers, who, to recap, LeBron, Smart, Kennard, Rui, DeAndre Ayton, all gone. Walker Kessler, Quentin Grimes, Colin Sexton, Sandro, Mamu, Kilavashki. Damn it, I had it up. But Mamu, who used to be a Spur, and Jaden Hardy, all in, right? And apparently with the idea that they really like, Jake LaRavia too, which is where you actually get they could run a lineup of Luca, Reeves, LaRavia, Mamu, and Kessler, and truly be the Snowtime Lakers, right? A bunch of white boys. Stephen A. Smith had a uh, quite a take as uh, about not being able to win with three white guys as your best players. That being said, uh, I don't really care about that. I will judge them more on the content of their skills than their skin color. To butcher a MLK quote there for you guys. On the moves themselves, this team. First off, it's wild when you think about Reeves and uh, Luca missed the entirety of the playoffs. Reeves misses, the first half, essentially, the first bit against almost all of the first series against Houston, and then comes back against OKC as well. So when you take those two guys out of it, LeBron, Smart, Kennard, Rui, Ayton, it's like the whole lineup. It's like the whole starting lineup for the Lakers in the postseason, and every single one of them's gone. I I did not believe going into the going into the free agency, going into this year. I should say I didn't believe going into this past season that the Lakers, if they had Luca, Reeves, and LeBron, would be able to put the necessary athleticism and shooting around them without trading one of those pieces, which obviously would have been either LeBron signing off because he had no trade clause, or trading Reeves because you weren't going to trade Luca. So keeping all three, I don't believe was actually tenable to winning a championship. So I understand the need to make moves. That being said, they got rid of everybody. And while I do think that this team fits better positionally and will have more clear and established roles, I still question whether they have the athleticism and defense, not the shooting, but the athleticism and defense around Reeves and Luca to cover up, you know, for their weaknesses in those areas. So Grimes, I think, is a fine defender, but he's not a Sir Thompson, right? He is not I'm going to both lock down, the best perimeter guy and make a ton of off ball steals and blocks and be able to cover up for mistakes on the perimeter. He's not I think he is, kind of a neutral impact, which is to say he's not a guy that you just pick out of the lineup necessarily and attack, but he's not covering up for other people's mistakes. And so, I still think, and an obvious, and he's the only one that they have on the perimeter, right? Like, connect, Mamu, Laravia, like those guys are not going to add a ton to you defensively either. If Connect even makes the rotation, your best athletes or defenders might be Jared Vanderbilt, who has his own issues on offense, and so it's going to be a lot of relying on Walker Kessler, and I think he's a very good player. I think he fits what you want. He's an excellent shot blocker. He's an excellent rebounder. This year he only played 5 games, but the year before in 24-25, he led the league in offensive rebounds per game at 4.5. but he has durability concerns, and I think they are going to need him to be on a Rudy Gobert level, a Victor Wembanyama level, a I am on the floor, your defense is fine. And I don't know that he's shown that throughout his career. So let's start with the durability concerns because that's the most straightforward. He played 5 games last year. The year before that, he played 58 games. The year before that, he played 64. The year before that, he played 74. Now, if you listen to me say those, you're like, Alex, those numbers went up every time. Correct. That was in reverse chronological order, though. The problem is, in order of the years he's played 74, 64, 58, and 5. He has played less games every single year of his career. I don't know a ton of big guys where it's like, hey, they start their career off and they just play less games every single year and then it gets better. Right? Um During his best season, right? So the 20, or and I should say his last fully healthy season, the Jazz were last in defensive rating. And you're like, well, Alex, it was the Jazz. They had a bad team around him. They didn't have good defenders around him. Yeah, I don't think the Lakers are going to have good defenders around him. I think he's going to have to cover up for 3 or 4 bad perimeter defenders. They were they had a defensive rating of 120 with him on the floor. They had a defensive rating of 121 without him on the floor. For his first 3 seasons with the Jazz, they had a defensive rating of 118 with him on the floor and a defensive rating with of 120 without him. So again, they were better when he was on the floor as opposed to off of it, but he was not a fix all. Um, for reference, 118 this year would have been worse, would have been 22nd in the league, right below the Denver Nuggets, who I thought going into the postseason, their defense, or rather lack thereof, made them ineligible to be a contender uh, for the title. That you just can't be that bad defensively. I think historically in the NBA, you need to be a top 10, a top 12 defense. Denver, with the best of Jokic, the year they won the title, I think was 15th. That's probably the lowest that you could expect to be. So I have concerns still about the Lakers defense, and because they gave up 2 unprotected first and 2 swaps, they can swap a first round pick in 2032. That is the only draft capital besides any second round picks that they have that they can use to make any improvements if need be. And that is a tough spot to be in, I think. I think they are going to need a level of play that Kessler hasn't really quite shown in his ability to cover everybody up. And even though I like them, and even though I think they fit better positionally, I think they're probably about in the same spot, which is a tier beneath the Spurs and OKC. And that they still don't really match up well with those teams who have multiple perimeter creators that are going to force at least one of, if not both, Luka and Reeves to have to guard and stay in front of on the perimeter. I think that is a tough spot to be in, and they've made a bunch of changes and given up all their flexibility. And I think they more or less ended up in the same spot. I do think they'll probably be better in the regular season because the offense over the course of 82 games will be better, right? I think it will function better when, at least when Luka's on the field, replacing, you know, Swiss Army knife LeBron with, a true, either stretch four in Mamu or just kind of an undersized four, but the guy that can shoot in Laravia. I think that will, kind of work better for the offense over 82 games in those lineups. I will say, however, some portion of the non-Luka ball handling, which will obviously mostly fall to Reeves, but last year the non-Luka minutes in terms of handling the rock fell to some combination of LeBron and Reeves, and now it's going to fall to some combination of Reeves and Colin Sexton. That is a downgrade. Like I think Sexton's fine as a backup guard to kind of eat up those minutes and those possessions to take some of the load off of your starters, but he's not as good as LeBron at that, right? Like those possessions are probably going to be a little worse. I just don't think there's going to be a ton of those because I think obviously you're going to put most of that on Luka and a lot of that still on Reeves, but some of those would have been point guard LeBron possessions are now going to be point guard Colin Sexton possessions, and that doesn't seem great. So I think by and large, they probably end up where they were, which is a second round ceiling when you run into OKC or San Antonio. But they will be fun to watch. But man, that's if they end up still on that ceiling to just kind of end the Lakers piece of this discussion, it's going to be interesting to see. I've told a lot of my friends every day that Rob Pelinka is still the GM increases the percentage chance that Luka doesn't actually sign an extension in LA and opts out and hits free agency and decides to go home, like back to Dallas or anywhere else for that matter. Which would be if he ended up going back to Dallas, that would be crazy. Him and Cooper Flag would be a ton of fun. But I really think that they're in basically the same spot, despite all of the movement, because they lost a ton too. And one other note, DeAndre Ayton's not a good player. But if you had Walker Kessler, I think I would have kept Ayton as the backup. They don't really have one. I guess they can play Mamu there as a stretch five as opposed to, Ayton. But, excuse me, I feel like that leaves them a little thin at forward. But regardless, they still don't have a 3-and-D wing. Supposedly, they're in talks with Jonathan Kuminga, which will help them be more athletic, but probably doesn't actually make them better, given that his issue in Golden State was, hey man, we really want you to be like a 3-and-D, use your athleticism kind of wing. We don't really want you to be like, hezzy tween ISO scorer. And with the Lakers, they would be asking him to be like a 3-and-D, use your athleticism wing, and that's not what he wants to do. So I'm not sure that would necessarily fit or work or solve that problem. I think they still have an athleticism and defense problem. I will say one sneaky little thing before I already said this was going to be the last thing on the Lakers, but I forgot I had one more. Cameron Carr, you don't usually find impact guys in the 20s, but he was someone that I called out for the Spurs to draft. The Lakers did take him. If his 3-point shooting translates immediately, I think he could end up being really important for them in a Derrick Jones Jr., but with a jump shot kind of way, because he's a great athlete and could be a really good defender. And if that's the case, then, that would really help. But again, you don't usually find year one impact guys in the 20s. So Lakers, I still think a tier beneath OKC. I still think a tier beneath the Spurs, which leaves them pretty much in the same place that they were, but looking very different and with much less flexibility moving forward than they had. So I talked about the Giannis trade when it happened. And then he didn't go to Boston. And I said, when the reports immediately after that were, well, That's it. That's the straw that broke the camel's back. Jaylen Brown, he's gonna be out of Boston, some way, shape, or form. And I came on here and I said, I don't think that's gonna happen. They almost traded him for Anthony Davis years ago. He was in trade talks for Kevin Durant, I think twice actually, and then trade talks with Kawhi, and now trade talks with Giannis. The Celtics are not going to give him away for anything less than a superstar. And the kind of human side of this, I was like, they've done this before. They'll work it out. They'll be fine. Well, maybe not. Maybe not quite. So there's a lot of aspects of this that have popped up and been talked about. So, real quick, if you've lived under a rock for the last couple of weeks, Jaylen Brown is no longer a Celtic. He is a Sixer. In return, the Celtics got Paul George and a couple of first round picks and a couple of seconds. So let me say, as someone who said he wasn't going to be traded, they've only put him in trade talks for legit, still in their prime superstars. To end up with Paul George and some picks feels like a massive bummer and a massive missed opportunity. And when you then, see the reporting that they just really wanted to keep Hugo Gonzalez and Baylor Shireman, I said when the Giannis trade went down that I thought that was a massive mistake from Boston and way overvaluing. I know Hugo's a teenager, so ostensibly there's a ton of upside there. Shireman, if I'm not mistaken, is like a 25-year-old in his second year. That doesn't usually turn into star players. I think you are aiming for the slimmest of possibilities that it actually ends up being worth keeping those guys as opposed to could have had Giannis. That being said, on this as it is, Paul George is obviously not what he was, not a great player. I do think, since I was very clearly wrong, that they weren't going to trade him, and it does sound like maybe the human side of this, this is how many times can you put me in trade talks? I've won a Finals MVP at this point. I've done everything. I just had a great individual season. Maybe Celtics worried Brown wouldn't actually want to go back to being number 2. Doesn't sound like he would want to go back, given that he said this was his favorite year, despite the fact that they got knocked out in the first round. So George, in that regard, will probably be way more willing to be second or third or fourth or just a guy on the team. And if you're Boston and you really like to shoot threes and you're going to, we're talking about Brown for George because obviously that's who they were traded for. But from a basketball standpoint, it's really more like Paul George in for where Jason Tatum wasn't last year, right? And Jason Tatum in for the super high usage piece of the offense, the number one option for Jaylen Brown, right? And if you're saying I'm going to turn Jaylen Brown's second highest usage rate in the league, and all of those possessions, or most of those possessions now, are going to turn into Jason Tatum at the center of my offense, then the guy off the ball, I'd probably rather have Paul George in the sense that he's a better three-point shooter, and I'm going to get more spacing out of him for my guy to, the Jason Tatum piece of this, the ISO guy to cook, as opposed to Jaylen Brown off the ball, maybe in a disgruntled manner. So, I kind of get that piece. It does look like a salary dump. there's been a lot of talk about the nerds and the analytics piece, which I'll touch on here. I think those are the wrong types of nerds to be talking about for this piece of the trade, actually. Because I don't think it was the analytics nerds. I think it was the finance nerds. I think this was more about, hey, Paul George only has 2 years left. Jaylen Brown has three, and we have no pressure at all to extend Paul George, right? Whereas Jaylen Brown was going to be up for, another Supermax extension. And is that really what you wanted to be tied to or feel like you had the pressure to do with, 2, 3 years left on his deal to kick that out 4 to 5 years for a guy that, you know, you think you have a better option in Tatum to do this style of basketball. So there is that piece. On the analytics piece of this. So I am someone who I do like the advanced numbers. I think they are very often better numbers than our regular counting statistics. So often they get framed as analytics versus eye test. That's really not the point. The point is more analytics versus basic stats and whether or not they're better at describing those things than, scoring efficiency, for example, right? Is true shooting percentage better than just field goal percentage or better than just effective field goal percentage? But I get it. There is no real catch-all stats in basketball for the way that we have with, LeBrons or PERs or BPMs or dunks and threes EPMs. Right. The only ones are either you're just raw plus minus, which I think everyone agrees does not shrink down to the individual really that well because there's so much out of your control that's captured in there, and or just wins, which is something that I think is very often the determination for most people as to whether or not your stats were empty calories, right, or meaningful. Is just, did the team end up winning? So on that point, in I guess defensive Boston or defensive analytics or whatever the case here, I will say a couple of things. One, Brown can't dribble with his left hand, which is not something that you need analytics for, and I think does hamper his ability to be one of the better super high usage players. Because I think it hurt. I think it makes him turn the ball over more, and he ends up. I think he's not quite as good a facilitator or passer out of that, in large part. But on the point of just like, can they win? Are they better without Jaylen Brown? If you're not an analytics fan and you're just vibes, wins, losses, basic stats, basic analysis, there's a lot of evidence that they can and maybe are better. So since he became an All-NBA player, which was 4 seasons ago, he made second team All-NBA for the first time in the 22-23 season, and then he was an All-Star the next 2 years, and then obviously this year. Yeah, in those seasons, they went 46 and 21. That's 66% of their wins, or 66% on the winning percentage. They went 11 and 4 without him in 23. That's a 73%. In 24, they were 52 and 18. They were 12 and 0 without him. 46 and 17, 73%. 15 and 4, 78% in 25, and then even this year, 47 and 24, 9 and 2, 81%, so 61 to 81. So that is total over 4 seasons. 191 and 80, winning 70% of your games, which is really good, which is how, as Brown has pointed out, he, since he's, I think, been in the league or whatever, has the most wins and playoff wins, right? He does have that. Also, and these are all regular season, they have won 47. They were 47-10, so they've won 47 of 57 games, which is 82% without him over the last 4 years, which ostensibly have been the best 4 years of his career with the All NBA nods and the All Star nods. There are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Make sure I had that number right. 15 other players, which I pulled from StatHead Basketball Reference, who in the last 4 years have been an All NBA player twice, which is what Jaylen Brown has done. And then from, as I've said, all stats on here, unless otherwise noted, are from Data Ball R or Basketball Reference. StatMuse, I went and asked these other 15 players their team's winning percentage with and without them for the last 4 seasons. Let me run through them real quick. SGA. First number I'm going to say is their winning percentage with them. Second number is without them. SGA, 72% with, 53 without. Jokic, 67, 48. Brunson, 63, 50. Giannis, 63, 42. Steph, 56, 43. Doncic, 58, 39% with Dallas, 66, 58 with the Lakers. LeBron, 60, 54. Mitchell, 68, 54. Tatum, 74, 68. Cunningham, 46, 31. Durant, 59, 29. I don't have all 4 or 5 or whatever his team's broken out. Edwards, 60, 56. Halliburton, 57, 37. Kawhi Leonard, 63, 44. Sabonis, 52, 30. Again, Jaylen Brown with 70%, without 82. He is the only player out of the 16 guys in the last 4 years that have been All NBA twice. He's the only one whose team wins a higher percentage of their games without them. The only one. That there's no fancy math being done there. There's no analytics. That is just straight wins and losses. It is not insane to sit here and act like that kind of player making the kind of money he makes is a contract that a team wouldn't want to get out of. Or one that apparently the whole league looked at and said, yeah, Paul George and a couple of first. Another contract that everyone agrees is underwater. We'll give you a couple first and we'll take Jaylen Brown so you don't have to give him the extension. The discourse around this has been analytics versus eye test and screw the nerds and F the nerds and guys, by the most basic of analysis, Boston has plenty of reasons to believe that their coaching staff, their front office, and their system and infrastructure can more than survive no Jaylen Brown, especially when you add in the fact Tatum's going to be back and fully healthy this year. And that we are going to turn what was the highest usage role on our team from Jaylen Brown to Jason Tatum. And we like that more. So, all that being said, I think there's plenty of non-analytic reasons why. On the analytics piece of this, if you're actually interested if you want to be able to say, this is what, the analytics people think of, or this is what the numbers say, a far more fair number for that is probably what can be referred to as the huge nerd index. So, Andy Bailey writes for Bleacher Report, basketball nerd on Twitter, and takes all the players uh, qualifies him for minutes played, and then for the whole season it's like 500. But he'll do this throughout the year with different benchmarks, and we'll take all of these guys' ranks in a bunch of nerdy stats, average them out, and then give you the rank. So, obviously lowest number, highest rank, number one, and put them all out. Uh, and then Tim McMahon named it Huge Nerd Index. That, as opposed to the Bobby Marks anonymous quote saying that Jaylen Brown is, like the 200th best player, because that's the seventh best player on a team generically, would put him at like 210 worst case or whatever uh in the league. That is a wildly fringe opinion, and not one that I think is actually represented by most of the catch-all metrics at all. uh, as someone who actually likes it, PR had him at 11, and that's probably the least nerdy of the advanced stats. Some other ones would have had him, I think outside the top 20, which I know would still be crazy to you guys for most of them. But regardless, huge nerd index, bunch of nerdy stats. What are your ranks in all of them? List everybody out. That this year had Jaylen Brown at 19th. That is still much lower, obviously, than finishing sixth in MVP voting. And right, that means you don't necessarily even have the most rock solid case to be the All NBA player. I am not trying to make the case that analytics actually views Jaylen Brown, more favorably than most people do. That's not the case. They don't. It doesn't. His true shooting percentage is below league average. That's going to hurt him in these stats. His assist to turnover ratio is not great. That's also going to hurt him a lot in here. And so I think there are very easy explanations and ones that don't really contradict the eye test all that much, to be honest. But probably are weighed a little heavier in these than what your eye test would weigh them. But 19th is a far cry from uh, from 200th. And so I just mentioned, right, he was second team All NBA in 23. He was uh, an All Star in between that, and then second team All NBA. He's a guy who's been an All NBA player twice, right? And if you look at kind of over the course then of the last 4 years, 19th, 20th, that about fits. That's clearly an all star and a guy who's kind of on the fringes of an all NBA team, right? And so I think that's much more fair. It's much more realistic and is also just a better snapshot of what the numbers actually say about Jaylen Brown, which is about my only beef with all of this is we have taken the Bobby Marks anonymous source quote and just plastered that over the entire analytics industry, which is not what I think those numbers say. Like I don't that again, you could find one particular stat. I think he was second in turnovers per game. So if I just took that regular counting stat, I could say he's even worse than that, right? Like I don't think that is a fair representation of what the numbers say and how he's viewed analytically. Um, and I would, I guess, defend analytics to the sense of, you know, if we just took the most fringe eye test takes, non-analytics takes, and then said, well, that's what everyone who just watches the game and doesn't ever look at the advanced numbers thinks, everyone would agree that that's also insane, right? If we just took Skip Bayless and we said, well, that's what everyone who just watches the games but doesn't look at the numbers thinks, a lot of y'all would revolt. Um, that's so again, there's my defensive analytics, I guess, so to speak. I think that is a very fringe take, that is being plastered as if it is mainstream, which it just isn't. And like I said, Andy Bailey on Twitter, huge nerd index. is a if you again, I'm not telling you if you don't want to dive into the numbers, don't dive into the numbers. But if you would just like to be enraged a little less, you will probably be enraged a little less with those and find that to be a much more reasonable gauge as opposed to Jaylen Brown's the 200th best player in the league. Whew. I am at 50 minutes. That is a long time. I still kind of want to talk about Jalen Duren and the Pistons, but I'll probably real quick. I am going to be fascinated moving forward as we talk about these aprons for this new class of young guys that I feel like Jalen Duren made an All NBA team at age 22, and it feels like if he had done that 5 seasons ago, they'd have paid him even with the playoff performance. No hesitation. You give him the money and you kind of chug along. But in this CBA, I do wonder if the guys who are actually going to end up earning less money, relatively speaking, is not going to be, look, guys like Wemby might take less, right, if they want to, but if they don't want to, like, you're still going to pay Wemby. If Wemby had said, "Nah, I'm not interested in that. I want 5 years, $300 million." The Spurs would have given him 5 years, $300 million. But it might be guys like Duren. It might be guys like potentially with the Spurs castle, where it's like, hey, you're a tier or maybe even 2 tiers down from that. We can't, right? Like, would Jamal Murray have gotten the contract he got under this? You're right. If he had been a young, kind of under this CBA, as opposed to in the transition, or we just started this, we're not 100% sure. I think that's going to be a fascinating thing moving forward. And so, is restricted free agency going to be more commonplace, right? Kessler, even I just talked about, right? Like, the Lakers got him because the Jazz were like, yeah, I don't really want to pay, right, and that ends up being a signing trade instead of, instead of him just re-upping with the Jazz. Which I should also note, I didn't say this at the time. I think the Lakers should have tried to call the Jazz bluff there. You still could have done the same. You didn't give up assets, right? You would have had the cap space to absorb the contract because you renounced everyone else's rights. Like, I would have called the Jazz's bluff. I don't think the Jazz wanted to match that offer. And maybe even shorten the deal, but up the average salary a little bit more to put more pressure. Like, I think the Lakers should have tried to call that bluff. I don't think the Jazz would have necessarily. I know they said they wanted to run out Kessler, Markkanen, and Triple J. I don't think they actually did. Their roster makes a ton more sense, to be honest, with like Triple J playing the weak side help, Markkanen not having to guard a ton on the perimeter, and then you put in Ace Bailey from last year at the small forward, Darren Peterson, and George. That makes way more sense. I would have attempted to call the bluff there, but that's Rob Pelinka, and the other guy is Danny Ainge, and so who wins that matchup every time? So I've gone on the tangent there, but I think it'll be fascinating moving forward if you're at all interested in the team building or cap aspects of this stuff, to see guys who in the past you would have paid, and you would have paid without hesitation, to see if they actually still get their money moving forward. But regardless, thank you guys for listening. Jesus, if you're still here 54 minutes later, it is late. I am recording this a little late. That's probably my fault there. It's like 11 o'clock now. But, jeez. What a way to end. Thanks, guys, for listening. Please like, rate, subscribe, all that stuff. Uh, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye.